She pretends to be a maid to test her fiancé's family, unaware she's billionaire heiress. Girl, where is the champagne? The Adeyemi family did not come here to watch you stand around. Sandra kept her eyes lowered, balancing a silver tray of drinks, the maid's uniform she'd borrowed feeling stiffer with every hour that passed. She said nothing. She simply nodded and moved toward the cluster of well-dressed guests near the pool. The family she was, in 11 days, supposed to legally become part of. Honestly, said a woman in a designer gel, not bothering to lower her voice as Sandra passed, these caterers hire anybody these days. Look at her, moving like she's never held a tray in her life. At least she's quiet, another voice replied, laughing. Better than the last one who kept asking questions. Sandra's grip tightened just slightly on the tray. Across the garden, her fiancé Richard stood laughing with his mother, entirely unaware that the woman he was marrying was 3 feet away from him, invisible in a uniform, watching his family speak about the help with a contempt that made her stomach turn. She hadn't planned to stay this long. She'd only meant to observe for an hour, maybe 2, a private, harmless test before committing her whole life to a family she barely knew beyond polished dinners and rehearsed smiles. But an hour in, she'd overheard something that had nothing to do with maids or manners at all. Once the wedding contracts are signed, a man's voice murmured near the study door, low enough that he clearly believed no one was listening. Her father's shipping company won't survive the quarter, and by then, it'll be too late for her to do anything about it. Sandra stood frozen behind the drinks trolley, the tray trembling almost imperceptibly in her hands. They weren't just mocking a maid. They were plotting against a woman who didn't yet know her own engagement had never been about love at all. Welcome to Becky Reality Stories. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Where are you watching from? I would like to connect with you better. Like, comment, and subscribe. Because tonight, we find out exactly what happens when a woman discovers the truth from the one place nobody thought to hide it from her. 6 months before that engagement party, Sandra Okonjo was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most eligible women in Lagos, sole heir to Okonjo Shipping Lines, a company her father, Chief Emmanuel Okonjo, had built from 3 second-hand cargo vessels into one of West Africa's largest maritime logistics firms. She'd grown up in a Banana Island mansion, educated abroad, groomed since childhood to eventually take over an empire her father had built with his own hands. What almost nobody outside her immediate family knew was that Sandra had spent her entire adult life deliberately, carefully, avoiding letting anyone get close to her for the wrong reasons. You attract 2 kinds of men, her father told her once, the 2 of them sharing a quiet breakfast on the terrace of their Banana Island home, a habit they'd kept since her mother passed years earlier. Men who love you, and men who love what marrying you would make them. The second kind is very good at appearing exactly like the first. How do I tell the difference, Daddy? You watch what they do when they think nobody important is watching. It was advice Sandra carried with her for years, quietly, never quite finding a practical way to use it. Until she met Richard Adeyemi. Richard was, on paper and in person, everything Sandra's careful instincts had been trained to be suspicious of. Handsome, charming, from an old, respected Lagos family with real estate holdings across Ikoyi and Victoria Island, and, crucially, seemingly uninterested in her father's company at all. I actually find shipping logistics unbearably boring, he told her, laughing, on their 3rd date, at a quiet restaurant he'd chosen specifically to avoid photographers. I'm in real estate development. My family's had property in Lagos for 3 generations. I promise you, I'm not after your father's boats. It was, Sandra would later realize, exactly the kind of thing a genuinely uninterested man might say. And exactly the kind of thing a very careful, patient one might say too. He courted her for 8 months with a steadiness that impressed even her naturally guarded instincts. He remembered details she mentioned only once. He never once brought up her father's business unprompted. He seemed in every visible way to want simply her. And by the time he proposed on a private beach in Lekki with no cameras and no audience, Sandra had allowed herself, cautiously, to believe her father's warning didn't apply here. I love you, Richard told her, kneeling in the sand. Not your family's company, Not your name in the business pages, just you." She said yes, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe the second kind of man her father had warned her about might simply not exist in Richard at all. The engagement party itself was to be held at one of Sandra's own properties, a sprawling event villa on the Lekki Peninsula that she owned personally, separate from her father's holdings, purchased 2 years earlier as a private investment few people outside her immediate circle knew about. She'd offered it to the Adeyemi family for the celebration without mentioning that detail, partly out of modesty, and partly, if she was honest with herself, out of the same careful instinct her father had taught her. Watch what they do when they think nobody important is watching. The idea came to her almost accidentally, 2 weeks before the party, during a dinner with Richard's mother, Mrs. Adeyemi, a woman whose warmth toward Sandra had always felt, to Sandra's private unease, slightly performative, adjusting in subtle ways depending on who else was in the room. "The catering company we're using is wonderful," Mrs. Adeyemi mentioned, reviewing menu options. "Though I always say, you learn everything about a family by how they treat the serving staff. My mother taught me that. People show you exactly who they are when they think the help doesn't count as an audience." The comment was meant, Sandra assumed, as a compliment to her own good manners. Instead, it planted a different idea entirely, a test her father had once described to her in theory, now suddenly practically available. She contacted the catering company personally, requested a temporary staffing role for herself under a false name, and told no one, not her father, not her closest friend, not even Richard, exactly what she planned to do at her own engagement party. "Are you sure about this?" she asked herself quietly, the morning of the event, looking at her reflection in a plain black and white maid's uniform instead of the designer gown that hung untouched in her closet for later. You could just trust him. But some quiet, careful part of her, the part her father had spent years training without either of them fully realizing it, needed to see, with her own eyes, exactly what kind of family she was about to marry into before she handed them her entire life, her father's company, and every vulnerability that came with both. She had no idea, tying the plain apron behind her back, exactly how right she'd been to be careful, or how much more than casual cruelty she was about to uncover. The party began at 4 in the afternoon, and within the first hour, Sandra understood exactly how invisible a uniform could make her. Guests who would have greeted her with warm, practiced smiles at any other event walked past her without a glance, treating the tray in her hands as the only part of her worth acknowledging. She moved through the crowd on the villa's manicured lawn, her lawn, though none of them knew it, refilling glasses, clearing plates, absorbing conversations that would never have happened in front of Sandra Okonjo, the fiancé. "Honestly," said a cousin of Richard's, adjusting her sunglasses as Sandra passed with a tray of chilled drinks, "I still don't fully understand why Richard chose her. Shipping money is fine, but it's not exactly old money, is it? Not like us. Old money, new money, it's all the same once it's in the family account," another relative replied, laughing. "Richard's smart. Marry the fortune, keep the family name looking respectable while doing it. Everyone wins." Sandra kept her expression perfectly neutral, refilling a glass with steady hands, while something cold settled permanently in her chest. It got worse as the afternoon wore on. Mrs. Adeyemi, the same woman who'd spoken so warmly to Sandra's face about learning a family's character through how they treated staff, proved remarkably consistent in demonstrating her own character to the staff she assumed weren't listening. "You," she snapped at Sandra, gesturing sharply toward a spilled drop of wine on the white tablecloth. "Clean that, quickly. We can't have Sandra's family arriving to a mess. They may not have much taste, but I won't have them thinking we're careless hosts." "Yes, madam," Sandra said quietly, wiping the table, keeping her eyes down. "And smile a little, would you? You're making the whole event look grim. I'm paying good money for competent staff, not sour faces." Sandra smiled, the practiced, hollow smile of a woman absorbing insult after insult from someone who had, 20 minutes earlier, hugged her warmly at the villa's entrance without recognizing her at all, beneath the uniform and the plain headscarf she'd tied over her styled hair. She found Richard near the pool an hour later, laughing easily with two of his groomsmen, a drink in hand, entirely at ease in a way he never quite seemed to be during their actual dates together. Looser, louder, more careless with his words. "She's sweet enough," Richard was saying, not realizing Sandra had approached close enough to refill the ice bucket beside him. "But honestly, between us, marrying into shipping money isn't exactly a hardship. Once the wedding's done and the business restructuring goes through, this whole thing pays for itself twice over." One of the groomsmen laughed. "Smooth, man. Does she know about the restructuring plan yet?" "Why would she need to?" Richard said, swirling his drink. "She trusts me completely. That's the whole point of choosing someone who's spent her whole life sheltered from real business. She signs whatever I put in front of her." Sandra's hands went very still over the ice bucket. "Restructuring plan." She finished refilling the bucket with mechanical precision, walked calmly back toward the kitchen staff area, found an empty pantry room, and allowed herself exactly 90 seconds to shake before forcing her hands steady again. It was in the villa's private study, 20 minutes later, delivering a fresh pot of coffee to a small cluster of men who'd excused themselves from the main party, that Sandra heard the conversation that changed everything. "The maritime insurance contracts are the key piece," a man's voice was saying. A voice Sandra recognized, with a jolt, as belonging to one of her own father's junior board members, a man named Tunde who'd worked at Okonjo Shipping for 6 years. "Once the wedding contracts are signed and the family assets legally merge, we move the insurance underwriting to Adeyemi Holdings. Chief Okonjo won't see it coming until it's already done. By the time he notices the change, the company's exposure will already be catastrophic. One bad shipment, one uninsured loss, and the whole thing collapses inside a quarter." "And the old man just steps aside quietly?" Richard's father, Chief Adeyemi, asked, his voice low and satisfied. "He'll have no choice," Tunde said. "Once Sandra's shares are legally tied to the marriage contract, Richard effectively controls voting rights on major board decisions. Okonjo built that company with his bare hands, and in 6 months, he won't own enough of it to stop what happens next." Sandra stood frozen just outside the study door, the coffee tray trembling in her hands hard enough that she had to set it down on a side table to keep it from rattling audibly. They weren't just marrying her for money. They were engineering the deliberate collapse of her father's entire life's work, using her own wedding contract as the mechanism to do it, using her own trust, the very quality Richard had spent 8 months carefully cultivating in her, as the final piece of a plan that had clearly been in motion long before he ever knelt in the sand at Lekki and told her he loved her for reasons that had nothing to do with her father's company. She had exactly 11 days until the wedding. 11 days to decide whether to confront them immediately or to do what her father had quietly taught her to do her entire life. Watch, gather everything she needed, and choose the exact right moment to make the truth impossible to hide from. Sandra didn't confront anyone that night. She finished her shift as instructed, collected her modest catering fee from the event coordinator with a quiet, "Thank you, madam," that nearly broke her composure, and drove herself home alone, still in the maid's uniform, her engagement ring sitting in her handbag instead of on her finger, where she'd removed it before the party began, so nothing would give her away. She sat in her car outside her Banana Island home for nearly an hour before she trusted herself to go inside and face her father without her voice shaking. "You're back late," Chief Okonjo said, looking up from his study desk, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. He took one look at his daughter's face and set his pen down immediately. "Sandra, what happened?" She told him everything. The mockery on the lawn, Mrs. Adeyemi's casual cruelty, Richard's careless confession by the pool, and finally, the conversation in the study that had turned her entire engagement from a mistaken judgment into something considerably more dangerous. Her father listened without interrupting, his expression growing more still, more controlled, with every detail. The particular stillness Sandra recognized from childhood as the specific quiet he reserved for the moments that frightened him most. "Tunde," he said finally, quietly, "I trusted that man with board-level access for 6 years. They're planning to move the insurance underwriting the moment the marriage contract merges our assets, Sandra said. They're counting on you not noticing until it's too late to stop. Her father was silent for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular, and then, slowly, something shifted in his expression. Not despair, but the same sharp, deliberate focus Sandra remembered from every serious business crisis of her childhood. Then we make sure, he said, that they never get the chance to find out we already know. What followed was 11 days of the most careful, quiet work Sandra had ever done in her life. She met privately with her father's most trusted legal counsel, a woman named Barrister Ijeoma Fashina, who had been advising Okonjo Shipping since before Sandra was born, and who reviewed the draft marriage contract Richard's family had prepared, with the focused, unhurried thoroughness of someone who had clearly been waiting her entire career for exactly this kind of fight. "It's clever," Barrister Fashina admitted, reading through the document line by line. Buried in Clause 14, subsection C, language that transfers voting proxy on all Okonjo Shipping Board matters to your future spouse upon marriage, framed as a standard spousal financial harmonization clause. Most brides never read past the romantic preamble. "I read everything," Sandra said quietly. "I just didn't understand until now exactly what I was reading." Barrister Fashina began drafting a counter-strategy immediately, not a public confrontation, but a series of quiet, legally airtight moves designed to protect Okonjo Shipping's assets and voting structure before the wedding date, regardless of whether the marriage proceeded at all. Meanwhile, Sandra continued behaving, publicly, exactly like a woman blissfully unaware of anything. Attending final wedding preparations with Richard, smiling warmly at his mother. Allowing Mrs. Adeyemi to critique flower arrangements and seating charts, without the faintest hint that the bride now knew precisely what kind of family she'd nearly married into. "You've been quiet lately," Richard mentioned, 4 days before the wedding, studying her with something that might have been genuine curiosity or might have been calculated caution. "Wedding nerves?" "Something like that," Sandra said, and meant it more literally than he understood. 2 days before the wedding, Sandra requested a final meeting with Tunde, her father's junior board member, under the pretense of discussing wedding logistics for the shipping company's corporate guests. She met him alone in her father's office. A meeting her father watched, unseen, through a partially open adjoining door, along with Barrister Fashina and a recording device that had been quietly authorized under Nigerian law for exactly this circumstance. "I wanted to thank you," Sandra told Tunde, "for everything you've done to help coordinate the wedding contracts. Richard mentioned you'd been instrumental in the whole process." Tunde smiled, entirely unaware of the trap closing gently around him. "It's been my pleasure, Miss Okonjo. Truly, I think this marriage is going to be wonderful for everyone involved." "I imagine it will be," Sandra said, "especially the insurance underwriting transfer. Richard mentioned you'd already worked out most of the details with his father about moving everything to Adeyemi Holdings once the contracts finalize." The smile on Tunde's face faltered, just slightly. Yes, we've discussed some restructuring options, standard post-merger consolidation." "Standard," Sandra repeated softly, "to leave my father's shipping company deliberately underinsured before an engineered exposure event, so the whole thing collapses within a quarter and Richard's family absorbs what's left at a fraction of its value." Tunde went very still. "I heard everything," Sandra said, her voice no longer soft at all. "In the study, at my own engagement party, while you all discussed the details in front of a maid you assumed was too invisible to understand what you were saying. I'm not marrying into blindness, Tunde. I'm the woman whose entire inheritance you've spent months quietly conspiring to destroy." The office door opened. Chief Okonjo stepped through, followed by Barrister Fashina, both having heard every word of the confession Tunde had just unknowingly provided on record. "Tunde?" Chief Okonjo said, his voice quiet in the particular way that had made grown businessmen nervous for 30 years. "You have exactly 1 hour to gather your personal belongings from this building before security escorts you out permanently. Formal legal action will follow shortly after." Tunde's face drained of color entirely. "Chief, please, I can explain." "You already did," Sandra said. "Just now. very clearly. As Tunde was escorted from the building, Sandra turned to her father, something settling in her chest that felt, for the first time in 11 exhausting days, close to relief. "The wedding's in 2 days," she said. "What happens now?" Her father studied her for a long moment, the same careful, measuring look he'd once used to teach her, over breakfast on the terrace, exactly how to watch for what people did when they thought nobody important was watching. "Now," he said, "we decide exactly how the Adeyemi family finds out that the woman they mocked at their own engagement party owns the house they were standing in, and exactly whose truth is about to come out in front of everyone." The wedding rehearsal dinner, 2 days before the ceremony, was held at the same Lekki villa where Sandra had once served drinks in a maid's uniform, a detail she'd insisted on, over her father's mild concern that it might seem needlessly theatrical. "They performed their true selves in that house once already," Sandra told him. "I want the truth to come out in the exact same place the lie was performed." The dinner proceeded as any rehearsal dinner might, toasts exchanged, polite laughter circulating, Mrs. Adeyemi holding court at the head of the table with the same warm, performative charm Sandra now understood to be entirely conditional. It wasn't until dessert that Chief Okonjo rose from his seat, tapping his glass gently, and asked for the room's attention. "Before we finish the evening," he said, his voice calm and measured, "I'd like to share something my daughter learned recently. Something I think this family deserves to hear directly from her, rather than through lawyers or headlines." Richard glanced at Sandra, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time in weeks. "Sandra? What's he talking about?" Sandra stood slowly, smoothing her dress, and looked around the table at the family she'd nearly bound her entire life and inheritance to. "2 weeks ago," she said, "I worked this party. Not as a guest, as staff. I wore a uniform, carried trays, and stood 3 feet from most of you while you spoke about me, about my father's company, and about your plans for both, as though I wasn't a person capable of hearing you." The color drained slowly from several faces around the table, understanding arriving in staggered waves as different guests recalled different comments, different moments, different careless words spoken in front of the help. "I heard the comment about old money and new money," Sandra continued, looking directly at the cousin who'd made it. "I heard you," she said, turning to Mrs. Adeyemi, "call my smile hollow and criticize my competence while I cleaned wine off your tablecloth." Her gaze moved finally to Richard. "And I heard you, by the pool, tell your groomsmen that I trusted you completely, that I'd sign whatever you put in front of me, because you'd chosen someone sheltered enough not to understand what was actually happening to her own inheritance." "Sandra? You can," she said. "In court, alongside your father and Tunde, who already confessed everything on record 2 days ago, explaining exactly how the marriage contract was engineered to transfer voting control of Okonjo Shipping to you, and how the insurance underwriting was set to move to Adeyemi Holdings the moment our assets legally merged, timed precisely to leave my father's company catastrophically exposed." The room had gone completely silent. "This house," Sandra added quietly, "the one you've all been standing in for the last 2 hours, the one I served your family drinks in 2 weeks ago while you called me incompetent, I own it. Personally. Purchased 2 years before I ever met you, Richard. I've been Sandra Okonjo, heir to a company worth considerably more than everything your family owns combined, this entire time. I simply chose once to find out who you really were before I let any of you find out who I really was." Chief Adeyemi rose from his seat, his composure cracking for the first time. "This is absurd. We've done nothing." "Tunde has already provided a full, recorded confession," Barrister Fashina said, stepping forward from where she'd been quietly seated near the door, "detailing your involvement, your son's involvement, and the specific mechanism by which you intended to defraud Okonjo Shipping of its insurance protections following the marriage. Formal charges are being filed this week. I'd strongly advise retaining independent counsel, separate from your sons, given the obvious conflict of interest." Mrs. Adeyemi, who had spent the entire engagement party lecturing Sandra's disguised self on judging families by how they treated the help, sat frozen at the head of the table, visibly grappling with the specific, devastating irony of her own words finally arriving home. The wedding, unsurprisingly, did not happen. Richard tried in the days that followed to separate himself from his father's scheme, insisting through increasingly desperate phone calls that he genuinely loved Sandra regardless of the business arrangement, that the restructuring plan had been his father's design more than his own. Maybe that's true, Sandra told him, the one time she agreed to hear him out, in a brief, final conversation at her lawyer's office, rather than anywhere more private. But you knew about the plan, and you knew I didn't. You let me walk toward a wedding that was designed to strip my father of everything he built, and you called it love the entire time you were doing it. I would have protected you from the worst of it. You don't get credit, Sandra said quietly, for planning to be slightly less cruel than your father, in a scheme you helped build from the very beginning. She left the office without waiting for his response. The ring he'd once given her on a beach in Lekki, left behind on the table between them, the final, unceremonious end of 8 months he'd spent constructing, with genuine skill. Exactly the kind of man her father had warned her to watch for. The legal proceedings against Chief Adeyemi, Richard and Tunde moved through the Lagos courts over the following 8 months. A slow, methodical unraveling of the scheme, built on Tunde's recorded confession, Barrister Fashina's forensic review of the marriage contract's buried clauses, and financial records showing the insurance underwriting transfer had been quietly in motion for nearly a year before Sandra ever wore a maid's uniform to her own engagement party. Chief Adeyemi was found liable for conspiracy to commit corporate fraud, ordered to pay substantial damages to Okonjo Shipping, and saw his own real estate holdings placed under scrutiny by regulators once the case became public. Tunde, whose cooperation had at least been immediate once confronted, avoided the harshest penalties, but lost his career in Lagos's shipping industry entirely. His name now permanently attached to the story in ways no amount of quiet relocation could fully outrun. Richard's fate was in some ways the quietest and the most complete. He faced no criminal charges. His involvement, while morally damning, hadn't crossed the specific legal lines his father and Tunde had crossed. But Lagos society, Sandra learned, had its own forms of consequence, separate from courtrooms. The story of the heiress who disguised herself as a maid to uncover her fiancé's family's plot spread quickly through the same social circles Richard had once moved through with such ease. And the charm that had once opened doors for him now closed them, one by one, as families who might have considered him for their own daughters quietly decided the risk wasn't worth it. Chief Okonjo, for his part, used the crisis as an opportunity his daughter hadn't fully anticipated. A reason to finally begin transitioning real operational control of Okonjo Shipping to Sandra herself, 6 years ahead of the timeline he'd originally planned. I always intended to hand you the company eventually, he told her. The two of them once again sharing breakfast on the terrace, the habit that had never quite broken despite everything that happened in between. But watching you handle the last 8 months, the patience, the discipline, knowing exactly when to act and when to wait, I don't think I need to wait any longer to be sure you're ready. I learned it from you, Sandra said. Watching what people do when they think nobody important is watching. You did more than learn it, her father said. You survived it. That's a different thing entirely. Sandra was formally named Deputy CEO of Okonjo Shipping Lines 3 months later, with a public transition plan announced for full leadership within 2 years. A move the business press covered extensively, several outlets specifically noting her composed handling of the Adeyemi affair, as it had come to be known, as evidence of exactly the kind of leadership judgment the company would need for its next generation. She didn't rush into anything after Richard. For nearly a year, she focused entirely on the company, on her father's gradual transition, on rebuilding the specific kind of trust in herself that 8 months of careful deception had quietly eroded, even though the deception had never technically been hers. When she did eventually meet someone new, a marine engineer named David, introduced through a mutual colleague rather than Lagos's usual social circuits, she found herself almost involuntarily watching him the same way her father had once taught her. Quietly, patiently, paying attention to what he did in the moments he didn't realize mattered. He never once asked about her father's company in their first 4 months of knowing each other. He complimented the villa's groundskeeper by name, remembered the assistant's birthday, tipped generously and without performance when nobody was specifically watching him do it. She told him the truth about who she was on their own terms, in her own time. Not as a test disguised as a party, but simply as an honest conversation between two people who'd already shown each other in 100 small, unremarkable moments exactly who they really were. Sandra learned that the truest test of character isn't what someone shows you when they know you're watching. It's what they reveal in the moments they assume don't matter, to people they assume don't count. The Adeyemi family learned that cruelty dressed up as good breeding is still cruelty, and that the people you dismiss as beneath your notice are sometimes the very people holding your entire future in their hands. And Chief Okonjo's old advice, watch what they do when they think nobody important is watching, became for his daughter not just a warning passed down from father to daughter, but the exact discipline that saved an empire he'd spent a lifetime building. If this story reminded you that character shows up in the smallest, quietest moments, hit subscribe, tell us in the comments what you would have done in Sandra's position, and share this with someone who needs to hear tonight that the truth always, eventually, finds its way to the light.